Hi everyone, my name is Tatiana and I'm a photographer. Recently I started a blog about travel and about other things that I'm passionate about. One of my recent blogs was titled How to Find Cheap Flights, and I'm here today to make a video about how I find those cheap flights. I used the tool Google Flights. After making my blog, I was still getting lots of questions about more specifics on how I find flights, and I wanted to make a video just so I can kind of walk through how I would look for a flight so that other people can see what I'm doing and use some of my techniques in order to get cheap flights so that they can travel more or just travel in general. Now, this is just the way that I have found to find cheap flights. Some people may have other ways, like using sites like Travelocity or the app Hopper, but I think that Google Flights has the best capability for searching for flights from different airlines at different times of day. Just to be noted, you can still be loyal to an airline while using Google Flights. It's just if you're finding the cheapest flights, you may always be flying different airlines, different times of the day. You may have weird layovers. So it's always a give and take situation whether you think that getting that cheap price is worth what the flight will be. Now, in some cases, you can get better flights for cheap. Like getting nonstop flights can sometimes be cheaper than getting flights that have long layovers or layovers in general. I also want to point out that using Google Flights is a very flexible tool. So whenever I'm planning a trip or starting to plan a trip, I try to be the most flexible I can be. If you are constantly trying to make certain dates work or being stubborn about what time of the day or how many layovers you're going to have, sometimes it is a give and take, like you'd rather just pay more to not have a really long layover, but we'll talk about that later when we're looking at flight options. Now I want to touch on briefly that I am living in Rochester, New York, so I am very close to a couple different airports that give me really good options for flights. I'm about a 3-hour drive from Toronto, about an hour from Buffalo, and even though it sounds like a long drive, I'm about 6 hours from New York City. Toronto and New York City are huge hubs for flights. They have tons of flights going in and out every single day, so finding really cheap international flights is going to be easier flying out of somewhere like Toronto or New York City rather than directly out of Rochester. With that being said, you can still find cheap flights even if you don't live near a main city if you're booking your flight well in advance and you are flexible with your dates and the times that you're leaving. Talking about budget and what I consider a cheap flight is kind of different depending on where you're traveling. For domestic flights, which would be within the United States, I like to budget about $100 to $300 round trip for my flights. It really depends on where you're going and where you're starting from. Obviously, if you have a longer flight, it's probably going to cost more, but that's not always the situation. That $100 to $300 range is really dependent on how far you're traveling. For me, when I travel from Rochester to Florida every year to visit my best friend Kate, I'm only paying about $100 to $150 round trip for those flights. That's because they have a lot of flights going from Rochester or Buffalo to the Tampa area every single day, and you can find them through cheap airlines or budget airlines like Southwest or Frontier. Now, these really cheap airlines can sometimes not be the best service-wise, but if you're only on a less than 3-hour flight from Rochester to Tampa, that might not be your biggest concern. So comparing that $100 to $150 ticket, if you're flying from New York to California, which is on the other side of the United States, you're going to pay closer to that $300 mark. Each time we've flown to California, we flew twice in 2018, we paid $300 or less for our round trip flights, and that was a really good deal. I would say finding a flight to California from New York, if you're flying from JFK, you could probably get it for about $250 round trip, maybe even cheaper if you find a really good deal. But from Rochester or Buffalo, we've paid about $290, I think, both times. So generally, I try to stick within that $300 max budget for a flight domestically. I do that not only so that I know that I'm affording the trip, but also because I want to make sure that the trip is worth it. I don't want to be spending $600 or $700 on a round trip within the United States if I know that I could get that same trip for way cheaper at another time of the year or just booked way in advance. On the other hand, international flights are obviously going to cost more because you're going longer distances and you're traveling outside of the country. As of now, any flight that I'm looking at for a European country, I'm looking at about $400 max round trip as my budget. When we flew to Iceland, we paid about $390 round trip, and that was booked kind of late. So I feel like we would have been able to find a cheaper flight than $390 to Iceland from Toronto if we had booked sooner. Looking into the future, when you book about 6 months in advance an international flight, you can almost find it anywhere in Europe or South America or the Caribbean for $400 or less. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions. If you're flying from New York to Tokyo or New Zealand or Australia, you're flying around the world and it's going to be pretty expensive. I haven't gone that far yet, so I don't really know much details about flying that far. But within the United States and to Europe, I have a pretty good idea of what to look for. Okay, so now that I've given you a bit of information about why I use Google Flights and about how much I budget for flights, I'm just going to use an example flight to show you how I actually search using the tool. To fly to Austin, Texas to visit some friends, and we're going to do about the April timeline, just as an example. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to put in your current location. I always start with Rochester, and then I also add in Buffalo just because sometimes it's way cheaper to fly out of Buffalo or Rochester, just depending on the airline or the time of day. Right now we're going to do a round trip, and then we're going to try Austin, Texas. We're going to put in a rough timeline for April. Let's say the end of April so that it's a bit warmer out, and I'm going to pick a 2-week time span. Sometimes the flights are just going to be cheaper because, it's not a holiday or people aren't traveling on those days, and sometimes airlines also have deals or sales, and that's why they're going to be cheaper. $243 looks like it's the cheapest. Let's just do like these 2 weeks and see what comes up. So now we're going to have all the flights that it's pulling that it thinks we want. So they're going to pick these one-stop flights from Buffalo to Austin. These ones are from Rochester to Austin for about $394 round trip. Once we go ahead and hit that date grid button, now we're going to see where the cheapest flights are. So like I said, I put a 2-week time span. Well, I don't really want to go for a full 2 weeks. I don't really have the time to do that. So if I hit date grid, I see that all these flights here are pretty cheap. About this is the sweet spot where there's pretty cheap flights. It's going to change your days to those days. Again, I said like maybe a 5 to 6 day trip. This one's $243 Buffalo to Austin. That's a great price. And then let's look at the price graph. This is going to tell you for a 7-day trip when it's going to be the cheapest. So if I go ahead and I make it a 6-day trip, going to tell me when the cheapest is going to be. So this is looking like April 22nd to Tuesday, April 28th. Let's push it back. Let's try that. Now it says, okay, we're going to leave at 5:21 p.m. It's Delta. Delta's a great airline to fly. That sounds like a good trip already. Buffalo to Austin, one stop, 35 minutes in Boston. Now that's a very short layover. For me personally, I don't like booking short layovers because they make me really nervous about missing flights, and I have a bad anxiety, so I'd probably avoid that. Let's look at this again. Look at the date grid again. So if we do Tuesday, it's probably gonna be the same flight though. So let's go ahead and select it anyway. And then we would leave at 6 a.m. So this is the thing about finding cheap flights. You're going to leave at weird times, like 5 p.m. and then 6 a.m. You're kind of cutting off the first and last days of your trip because you're going to be traveling most of those days. This one's 9 hours with a one stop in Boston for 4 hours. I already know that Buffalo to Austin is going to be cheaper. So I'm going to take away Rochester. And then I'm going to keep my dates for now. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make one stop or fewer. And then I'm going to do price, and I want my price to be $300. The reason why I don't do this to start with is because sometimes wherever you're going at whatever time, there's just not flights that cheap. So I don't really do the price until after I get a general idea of where I should be flying to and how much those flights should be. So this is the same one for $243, but let's look at the details. So this one is pretty low. So $243 is looking like the lowest you're gonna get. I love these little graphs because they give you an idea of how much you're paying. You never want to pay for anything in the red. let's say I don't want to book the lowest of the low because I don't want to like do this 35-minute layover and I really don't want to, you know, deal with those weird times. We could do the next one, which would be 264. It looks like it's the opposite, so you're leaving super early in the morning, so you still get there before noon. I like that, and you get a 1 hour layover at JFK. Now that sounds way more appealing to me. I don't mind waking up early. And then this one leaves at 7:19 p.m. and it's 11 hours. That's pretty long. Let's see what other options they give us. So for the flight to go up, to get those better prices, you're doing a 17-hour flight. Like, that's not fun. To see what else is going on those days. So now that I've put all those restrictions in, one stop or fewer, under 300, a lot of days are canceled out. And that's just what you're going to get. If you want to get real specific, you're going to have a lot of things canceled out. The more flexible you stay, the more options you're going to have. Let's change our dates. Let's go earlier in the month. Let's do... There's this little sweet spot here. The 15th to the 22nd. This is the same one we saw earlier. And it's that same funny flight. See, you'll see the same flights over and over, just different dates because they have the same routes. So let's just choose it anyway for the sake of choosing a flight. I'll stock them later. And let's say we're gonna just take this one. It's actually not that bad of a flight. I really hate short layovers. The price is really good. You're still gonna get your 6 days. Delta's a great airline. I would say this is actually a decent flight. You're gonna go ahead and track your flight. Let's say that's the one you want. And then you're gonna go ahead and hit tracked flight prices here. And of course you're gonna see like all the other flights that I was tracking for this Austin trip, which I was gonna originally think about planning for end of February. So you're going to see that the other trip I was planning in February was the same price, $243, and now it's up to $400 just because it's really close. But if we look at the April 15th one, now it's still $243. Looks like it's probably the same flight actually. Yep, same flight information. It's really not that bad of a flight. I honestly might take this one. But you can go ahead and hit price history. Now let's look at this old one so you can see how it jumps. But you're going to see that, oh, the flight, this is when you start tracking the flight. So that's when your little graph is going to start. This is when you started tracking, this is today, and you can see how your flight grows. By this trend, I don't think this flight is going to drop down again. So obviously, for other reasons, I've also stopped planning the trip for end of February, but it's really close to be booking a trip. For domestic flights, I usually book about 2 to 3 months in advance. For international flights, I usually book about 6 months in advance, which does sound very far out, but when you look at the prices, it makes so much more sense to book sooner. But yeah, so this is like a pretty good flight, but you can see how it's gone up. And now it's $400, and we're not going to pay for that because that's out of budget. But this April 15th to April 22nd is actually a really good deal. It's $243. That's under my $300 budget, and I've started tracking it today so I can see how it fluctuates. So going back to this main page here, I just want to talk about some of the features that you should be using. I know I kind of took a while to like search through this flight. I just wanted to give you an example of how I really would look for a flight. One of the main things I want to touch on is round trip versus one-way and multi-trip or multi-city. Multi-city is when you can choose your first destination or where you leave to your first destination, and then where you're leaving from the second time to coming back home. So for instance, if I wanted to go from Buffalo to Austin, but then I did a road trip to Dallas and then flew from Dallas to Buffalo, look, the trip is still $251, and it's actually probably a better flight. Definitely different airlines, so you're gonna have to book through 2 different airlines, which is never really a problem. But it looks like this one leaves at a better time. The other one leaves at 6 a.m. So if I did that, if I was doing a road trip, that would be a really good option. So multi-city is really cool for road trips if you're going somewhere and then doing a road trip, or if you want to hit several destinations while you're flying out somewhere. Like if you're going to spend the money to fly somewhere, you might as well hit a couple different places while you're there. Like for instance, we flew from Buffalo to Seattle, and then we road tripped from Seattle to LA, and that was you know, a very big road trip. We did it in 10 days, but we were able to use the multi-city function to get a really good deal on a round-trip flight. Like I said, I think we paid less than $300 for that flight. I think it was about $280 or $290. And we flew into one stop and out of another. So you can still find good deals by doing that using the multi-city function. And I want to just show you the date grid function again. The date grid is such a good thing to use to narrow down your dates for a trip. Like I said, usually if you want to take a trip, give yourself like 2 to 3 weeks of a time span that you know that you could go on your trip. That way, if you know you want to only plan a 5-day trip, but you have 3 weeks to plan it, like roughly 3 weeks, you'll get a better chance of finding a cheap flight. If you're like, I can only leave on the 1st and I can only come back on the 5th, like odds are you're not going to find the cheapest flight. I also showed the price graph, which is very visual. You can even knock it down to however many days you want to do. So let's say 7-day trip. And it's going to tell you when in that month it's going to be the cheapest to fly. Just by using those price graphs and the date grid and being able to plug in different destinations, you could even add in Dallas if you weren't sure which place you wanted to go to most. You can also do Rochester, like give me the cheapest flights. I just need to get to Texas from upstate New York. And it'll keep adjusting to those different destinations. That's one of my favorite parts about it. Then you can also just track a general flight for those dates. Like let's say you could only travel from the 8th to the 15th. You could just track the flights and it's going to tell you when those flights go up or down. You will get a notification if your flight drops or increases significantly, but I check my flights almost every day. I'm a little crazy about it. I like to make sure I'm getting the best deal. If you go to your track prices, you'll be able to see, is this one going to go up? Yes, it's not going to go down. This one actually started high and went down, so maybe that's a better time to buy, but still out of budget. So this was just me showing you how I find the cheapest flights. Again, you might have to compromise with long layovers or different airports or different airlines, but if you would rather just save the money on the flight, that usually doesn't matter too much. If you would like to see any more examples of how I find flights, let me know. So I hope that this was a better visual representation of how I find my flights and that this helps you find flights for your future trips at home. Again, just to recap, if you're doing anything domestic, I wouldn't spend any more than about $300 if you have the flexibility to do so. And for anything to Europe, I would say about $400. And even kind of for the Caribbean and South America, you can generally get away with that $400 mark. So if you have any other questions, just leave them in the comments down below. Make sure you follow my blog, subscribe, like, and comment on this video. And thank you so much for watching.